I'm David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here. We're coming to the last 3 or 4 talks in this 14-part series that's been covering the collections, the modern collections of the East Building. And again, this is sort of in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the opening of the East Building in 1978. Today, we're talking about the group of artists who represent what you might call the golden age of painting in Washington, D.C. And these are the so-called artists of the Washington Color School. You're looking at a painting on the screen by Paul Reed from 1965. That's in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It's not in our collection. So today we're going to devote our attention to our own sort of artists here in D.C. So one of the things that was decided with the renovation of the East Building and the expansion of the floor space was that we should do something to acknowledge the artists that were our own local artists of the Washington Color School. In the past, we really did not pay tribute to these artists. We may have had a painting up here or there, but it was something really not appropriate for the National Gallery of Art not to recognize the artists that are very much here in Washington. So we've rectified that situation. So now we do have a devoted, dedicated space, very nice and very ample, to the artists of the Washington Color School. We can't accommodate all of the artists still, so this is a space, like many others, in which the paintings are rotated. So you'll see something 1 month, and maybe 3 months later, you'll see something else. We even have a wall plaque that you can see here. That tells you what you're looking at and why these artists are sort of together. So this is one of the installation photographs on the right that shows Gene Davis's painting called Black Popcorn, straight ahead, this one here, from 1965. And then this is an untitled work by an artist who is sort of tangentially associated with DC Color School, Washington Color School. That's Paul Feely. That's an untitled painting from 1962. Just a few little other shots here. Of course, this is the DC, the Washington Color School is kind of out of the view here. This is looking into the abstract expressionist galleries that we've already talked about. So again, Black Popcorn and Untitled. Feely's interesting. He was included with in a number of exhibitions with the Washington Color School. One of the most important was one that Clement Greenberg curated at the Coutts Gallery, Kootz in New York, and it was an exhibition called Emerging Talent. It had many of the Washington artists. Feely's actually not from DC, he was born in Brooklyn, but he was included in that exhibition. So oftentimes you had color school with sort of hard edge painters like Feely and a few others, for example, Al Held. Here's Al Held. I think this is off view now. So this is what the room looks like, at least the space, although the works have changed. This is a work by Sam Gilliam, Morris Louis, Kenneth Young, and Al Held. That's called Black Angel from 1964. So a number of artists are associated with the Washington Color School, and pretty much now, depending on when you come to visit, they're almost all represented in our gallery at one time or one point or another. This is Gilliam's work called Relative from 1968. And this is the Morris Louis Beta Kappa from 1961. We're going to be talking about that. I'm just showing you some general overviews at the moment. Last time I went up, this is what the wall looked like. It could have actually changed. This is Thomas Downing, Leon Berkowitz, and Alma Thomas here. Berkowitz is a very important Washington artist who founded the center, what was known as the Washington Workshop Center for Artists in 1945. And this was a very important center that became a kind of cultural catalyst for the Washington area. It wasn't just for the visual arts, it was for dance and music and a lot of other initiatives. And the Washington Color School artists found a lot of support from that particular center. Again, Berkowitz is certainly interested in color, but technically, he doesn't really technically fit within the sort of concept of the DC Color School. But talking about his art in 1976, Berkowitz said quote, "I am endeavoring to find that blush of light over light and the color within the light, the depths through which we see when we look into and not at color." So again, his paintings are certainly very optical, very beautiful. This is a painting called Coronation in the center from 1979. Of course, our collection, the National Gallery's collection, was greatly enhanced when we acquired works from the Corcoran. The Corcoran was in some ways, the focal point and the epicenter for a number of the color school painters, especially as faculty members there. So when the Corcoran collection came into the National Gallery, that has given us a tremendous sort of boost in the number and quality of the works that we have representing this local school. So again, just a couple of other views, showing you the Al Held here. I'm pretty sure that's now off view. Now, we will have to talk about theory, a little bit of theory. Not so much manifestos, you'll be happy about that. But we will be talking about the critics who become so important at this point in time in the period after abstract expressionism. So abstract expressionism dominates the 40s into the early 50s. But after we get into the second generation of abstract expressionists, you can only be avant-garde for so long, and then you're not avant-garde anymore. And so one of the biggest questions in American art at this time, mid-50s into the early 60s, is what would be the successor to abstract expressionism? What movement, what group of painters would succeed the abstract expressionists? And believe me, this was a hotly debated, hotly contested concept, discussion, problem, and it played out in really two places: art journals, so like Art News, etc., and it played out in museums, where curators would put forward their choice as a successor through museum exhibitions. So this is what we're going to begin to sort of talk about a little bit. But the two of the dominant names, there are many. Thomas Hess is important. Leo Steinberg is important, but two that are represented here, Clement Greenberg on the left and Harold Rosenberg on the right. Their attitudes and points of view would sort of come together as a kind of, I don't want to say necessarily opposition, but as two different tracks or choices that were presented as the successor to abstract expressionism, and they were each one was quite different. So we're going to be talking about these gentlemen, especially as we get a little bit deeper into the discussion today. This is a photograph on the left of Helen Frankenthaler and David Smith, and they're in front of Mountains and Sea, which is the painting we now have here at the National Gallery that you can see. That is up, I'm pretty sure, from 1957. And then on the right, you have a photograph of Greenberg, Frankenthaler, and Kenneth Nolan, a member of the DC color school. This photograph is from 1957. Frankenthaler and David Smith were very, very close friends, but of course Frankenthaler marries Robert Motherwell. And on the right, that photograph is in Connecticut from 1979. What I'm showing you here is a kind of transition or a kind of the conduit from abstract expressionism to the color school. Greenberg is important in both cases. He had been the champion of Pollock, of abstract expressionism, of the New York school. Of course, later he sort of turned away from Pollock and championed Clifford Still and the sort of field painters more than the gestural painters. Frankenthaler was an important part of New York school painting, along with all these other artists, many of whom we've already talked about. And she had already moved towards the idea not of creating work through gesture, but through staining canvas, unprimed canvas rolled out on the floor that she would then pour paint onto. And of course, for Greenberg, this was the ultimate sort of aesthetic perfection because it stressed the two things he was most interested in that define painting: flatness. You can't get flatter than the paint in the canvas, in the weave. It's not sitting even on a gesso layer or on a preparatory layer. And color. Those two things for Greenberg define painting: flatness and color. And so he was a great champion of Frankenthaler, and it was Greenberg who suggested to the Washington artists, two in particular, Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan, that they should go to New York and look up Frankenthaler and see what she was doing and be aware of this sort of staining technique. So that's what actually happened. And the painting they saw in Frankenthaler's studio was this one. So that's the painting they actually saw, and here it is, here. They made this fateful trip, Louis and Nolan, in April of 1953. They went to New York, and Greenberg sort of introduced them, and they saw Frankenthaler at work and saw this painting and this process now of staining raw, unprimed cotton duck canvas. And as Nolan later said, what he sort of saw in this moment, and he came up with this kind of mantra, I guess, thin it, use it the same way as dye. So like you're almost dyeing the canvas. And then he went on to say, thinness reveals color. So they immediately were converted, both Nolan and Louis, to now attempting to sort of expand upon what Frankenthaler had already sort of opened up. So here is Helen Frankenballer later. This is not in 53, this is 1969, when she's in her studio, and you see how she works. She puts the canvas on the floor, it's unstretched, unprimed, and then she takes her colors right from the can or some other kind of vessel and then pours them out. And then she might move it around with her hands or with some kind of blotting tool. The tools could vary. And notice the scale is large, all of this. Now, Greenberg came to believe that the true successors to the New York abstract expressionists, the New York school, were not the second generation New York school artists. He now started to find those artists as repetitive, hackneyed, just sort of now working from a formula. Everybody was, going crazy with gesture, and he found it now to be essentially derivative and lacking in any kind of real quality. So he had to look around for his group, and he decided it would be the Washington artists, that it would be Louis and Nolan and a group of painters who were associated with Louis and Nolan. And then we come to a very important exhibition, just as I mentioned a second ago. Once you decided on your guys or girls, or guys and girls, then you had to sort of get them out in front of the public. And if you were Clement Greenberg, that wasn't going to be much of a difficulty. So he curated an exhibition that did not open in New York or in Washington. It opened in Los Angeles. And it's a landmark exhibition in the history of American art of the 20th century. And the exhibition was called Post-Painterly Abstraction. And this is the exhibition cover, catalog. You have to open it up to see the rest of the post-painterly abstraction. That's the exhibition catalog. This was in Los Angeles in 1964. It opened on April 23rd, 1964, and ran until June 7th. It then traveled to the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis and to the Art Gallery of Toronto. And it was in the essay for this exhibition that Greenberg now had to make his case. He had to make his case for these Washington artists. And so first he had to say why he was now losing faith in the New York artists of the second generation. So he said in part in his essay talking about, quote, the 10th Street touch. Remember, these artists were all between like 8th and 12th Street, He said the 10th Street touch had descended into, quote, a set of mannerisms, according to which, quote, a dozen, then 1,000 artists proceeded in more or less the same ranges of color and with the same gestures. In other words, now everybody's doing it. And so that's no longer what we want. So the Los Angeles show featured the works of 31 painters, and almost all of what we today think of as the Washington Color School painters were in that exhibition. And Greenberg had, even before that exhibition, when he was formulating his ideas about who would succeed the abstract expressionists, had stated why he thought the DC artists would be the logical heirs, and he said this in reference to both Lewis and Nolan. He said, quote, Lewis and Nolan, quote, who both live in Washington, D.C., which fact is not unrelated to the quality of their work. From Washington, you can keep in steady contact with New York, with the New York art scene, without being subjected as constantly to its pressures to conform. So now he said Washington was an advantage. You're not amidst all of these people who think you should be a second or third generation abstract expressionist. You don't have to deal with all that New York school stuff. You're close enough from DC to get to New York to see what's going on and keep tabs on things. But because you're not living there, you're not painting there, your studio's not there, you have a kind of freedom. You're somewhat insulated a little bit and can follow your own sort of path. Now, what I'm showing you on the right is Clement Greenberg's apartment in New York City. And it's a photograph from 1963, and you'll notice what's on the wall here. And that is a painting by Kenneth Nolan. It's called Gift, and because it was a gift from Nolan to Greenberg, it dates 1961-62. This is the painting that's hanging in his study above his, or near his desk. So you have to imagine that when he's formulating all these ideas, he's not looking at a Jackson Pollock, he's looking at a Kenneth Nolan, and maybe this is sort of affecting his thought processes. Here is Greenberg with Nolan on the left. This is later from the 1970s. And on the right is that painting called Gift. That's today it's not even in the United States, it's at the Tate in London. Gift from 1961-62. It's a 6-foot square painting, the concentric rings that, of course, Nolan will become famous for. There's a subtle sort of tinted background. He gives it to Greenberg as a kind of a thank you for the support that Greenberg has been giving him. And Greenberg loved this painting, obviously, and it was definitely a presence in his apartment where he could look at it and sort of study it and ruminate on it. Now, I'm mentioning Greenberg advancing the cause of the Washington Color School. By no means was that the universal choice as successors to the abstract expressionists. Certainly Harold Rosenberg didn't go down that path, even though he had championed, both Rosenberg and Greenberg had championed the New York School, but they had thought about it in different ways, and I'll come back to Rosenberg in a second. But there were other people weighing in, and these contributions, or these new sort of candidates, I guess, were playing out in museum exhibitions. So 3 of the most important candidates that came forward as the successors to the abstract expressionists were all given exhibitions at MoMA, and they were all curated by influential art historians who were putting forward sort of a candidate. So one of the most interesting was this catalog, and the exhibition was New Images of Man. And it was at MoMA in 1959, from September to November 1959. This was curated by Peter Seltz, S-E-L-Z. Now, Peter Seltz we associate with as the great art historian of German Expressionism, and indeed he is. In my estimation, he's the best art historian to read on German Expressionism. In any case, he was a guest curator here, and he curated this exhibition at MoMA, and he advanced the return to figuration, New Images of Man. He thought, okay, enough of all this abstraction and gesture and process. Let's go back to the human figure. I've mentioned to you before that there was a big debate at this time about, even going back to the turn of the century, around the time of the First World War, about whether we hadn't exhausted the human figure as a subject for art. What more can you say or do with the human figure that hasn't already been done? And so that was a big debate, and Seltz weighed in on that debate, in essence asserting that, wait a minute, there's still a lot to say with the human figure. Notice he puts a Giacometti on the cover of the catalog. So that's one candidate. The other one is represented in the center catalog cover, and that was the exhibition called The Art of Assemblage. That was curated by William Zeitz, who was in fact the curator at MoMA of 20th century art. And what Zeitz put, this show was in 1961, from October to November of 1961. And what Zeitz put forward was an idea, and this would have been supported and was supported by Rosenberg, not Greenberg, that what we should look to is assemblage, collage, material art that sort of exists in the world but is put together in a new way. It had aspects of, you might say, neo-Dada, going back to Schwitters and all those people. And that was a whole different paradigm than figuration, a whole different paradigm than abstract expressionism. So that show was that was his throwing his hat into the ring. And then Seitz, because he was a curator at MoMA, got to do a lot of exhibitions. And then he himself thought, well, wait a minute, maybe there's yet another candidate that I should advance. And that came about in 1965 with the exhibition you see at the lower right. That's the catalog cover for The Responsive Eye. That show was at MoMA in 1965. And what Seitz put forward with that was op art, O-P, optical art. So people like Bridget Riley. I mean, there were some hard-edge people in that show, Ellsworth Kelly and some others, but now he was putting forward this idea of optical art. So we have three different candidates here, and I haven't mentioned Harold Rosenberg yet, but I will come to him. So my point is there's a lot of discussion, a lot of ferment, a lot of, not controversy, it's healthy. It's a healthy debate. Everybody's weighing in, museums, curators, critics, art historians, the courses that they're teaching, all of this stuff. Everybody's got an opinion. Now, getting back to DC. Okay, so what the heck's going on here? Well, there are so many important protagonists in Washington at this time, in the 50s and 60s, couple of important spaces, gallery spaces. I think the sort of grande dame, maybe sometimes I think of her sort of as the Washington Peggy Guggenheim, is this lady, and that's Alice Denny. So this is Denny. She's still with us, as far as I know. This was 2015. I think she was 96. She was born in 2015. I'm serious, that's a photo from 2015, sorry. She was born in 2015. And I think now she's like 96 or 97. This is a photograph on the left that's undated from, she was born in 1922, I have it here. So Alice Denny is a great, one of the grand dames, I guess, of Washington Color School and Washington art in general. She actually studied medicine at Duke University, then she transferred to Drexel, where she completed a master's degree in nutrition. She took some fine art courses, art history courses there, and then she began more and more to be interested in the arts. She came to Washington in 1950, which was a perfect time. And she is the woman who founded a very important gallery for the Washington Color School, and that's the Jefferson Place Gallery, which was a cooperative gallery that was designed to support modern and contemporary art, but more specifically to promote Washington, D.C. artists. She actually founded that gallery and didn't want to be the first director of it, quite frankly. She founded it, and so she became, by choice, the assistant director, and gave the directorship over to an art historian named Adeline Breeskin, who had just come from Baltimore. She had retired from the Baltimore Museum of Art. I'm sorry, that's the Washington Gallery for art, not Jefferson Gallery. I'm going to get to that in a second. So she opened up the Jefferson Place Gallery. She stayed there only a few years, and then, this is where I was going, she opened up the much more important space, which was the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. So make sure I didn't confuse you. She opens up Jefferson Place Gallery. That is a running concern. Then she leaves that after a couple of years to open up something much bigger and better and more important, and that's what we called, again, it's gone, the Washington Gallery of Modern Art in 1962. That's when, as I said, she decided she didn't want to direct that. She chose to be the assistant director, and she brought in Adeline Breeskin from Baltimore, who had been the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, one of the first women directors of a major museum in the United States. So there were four directors of the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. Breeskin from 62 to 64, Gerald Nordland from 64 to 65, and he went on then to San Francisco. Charles Millard from 65 to 67, and then the name I'm sure you're familiar with, he oversaw the end of it, and that's Walter Hopps from 67 to 68. So these two spaces, let's take the Jefferson Place Gallery first. Here it is, or was. This is a photograph from 1972. This was actually an exhibition, not laundry, of foam sculptures by a sculptor named Ed Zerne, Z-E-R-N-E. So this is the Jefferson Place Gallery that was kind of at the confluence of Connecticut, 18th Street, and this small street, Jefferson Place. So it kind of was at that location. Denny opens this in 1958, before she opens the Washington Gallery. The second director of this space, because again, Denny's there only for a short time, is a very important woman, the second director. Her name is Nesta Dorrance, D-O-R-R-A-N-C-E, Nesta, N-E-S-T-A, Dorrance. And she really is the force behind the initial sort of impetus for the gallery. By 1966, the Jefferson Place Gallery had come to focus almost exclusively on area talent, DC artists, not much else. It had different locations, P Street, a couple of locations on P Street, et cetera. And then it did finally close in 1974, but not before having a huge impact on the Washington art scene by virtue of the artists that it supported and gave frequent exhibitions to. So here are a couple of announcement cards. These are all from the Jefferson Place Gallery. There's a show for Kenneth Nolan in 1958, Willem de Looper in the upper right from 66, Gene Davis, recent paintings down below from 59, Sam Gilliam, recent paintings from 65, and then the lower right, Hilda Shapiro Thorpe, who basically we refer to Hilda as Hilda Thorpe, sculpture from 1968. These are all Jefferson Place shows. And so this becomes the core gallery for now establishing that there is a culture scene in the visual arts and that we have gifted artists and painters. It does exist and last until 74. But the more important space is when Denny decides we need something better, bigger, and so she becomes the founder of the Washington Gallery of Modern Art, even though she gives over the directorship to Breeskin. This is Adeline Breeskin. On the left, the photograph of Adeline Breeskin. And that's building on the right is today associated with the Polish embassy. It's their economic sort of place where they deal with trade. It's not the embassy itself. It's where they deal with trade issues. And it's at 1503 21st Street Northwest. So it's the economic section of the Polish embassy today. That was the location of the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. So the gallery is founded by Alice Denny, but she gives over the directorship pretty quickly to this young lady here, Adeline Breeskin. You may know Breeskin because she died, I think, in 2000 or right around there. She was one of the greatest scholars of Mary Cassatt. She wrote the catalog raisonné on Mary Cassatt. So she was at the Baltimore Museum of Art as a curator, then she became director, and then from when she retired from Baltimore, she came to DC. So she's the first director, then as I mentioned, Charles Nordland, then Charles Millard, and then Walter Hopps. Eventually this space, this building, became known as a kind of annex to the Corcoran. It was referred to then as the Corcoran Gallery of Art DuPont Center in 1968. So it did have an affiliation then with the Corcoran when Walter Hopps was sort of overseeing its demise, shall we say. Now, many important exhibitions here, but the one we're most focused on is the one that put, for more or less, the Washington Color School artists on the map, even more than in some ways the LA show by Greenberg. And this is the catalog on the left. The Washington Color Painters, that took place in 1965. And here are the names of who was in this show. So these are some of the major protagonists, not everybody. Morris Louis, Kenneth Nolan, Gene Davis, Thomas Downing, Howard Mehring, and Paul Reed. They're all in this exhibition. And this was a major major exhibition of Washington Color School. It opened on June 25th, 65 at the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. It traveled to the University of Texas, the University of California. It went on to Brandeis University, and then finally it ended up at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. So it got a lot of national exposure. And in some ways, this is the show that put these artists on the map. Now people were looking at Washington. Well, maybe it isn't just about politics and corruption and all that kind of stuff. This is a later 3-volume, this is volume 2 of a 3-volume set written by a French art historian, Claudine Humblay. And in fact, she puts on the cover a painting by Paul Reed. Here, this is 3 volumes. And the Washington Color School now is even known in France. This book is written in French. It's a French sort of discussion of the artist. And it's 3 volumes, and it covers what was she called the New American Abstraction from 1950 to 1970. So this is sort of our moment now. There's various resources and sources and materials around DC still that fortunately have been preserved. The Smithsonian American Art Museum, their library, has a lot of ephemera, invitations, announcements, magazine articles, newspaper articles. So I'm showing you some here. This relates to Paul Reed and to Thomas Downing. That's Paul Reed, Morris Louis, Hilda Thorpe, Howard Mehring. This is an interesting article they've preserved. Not everybody liked this stuff. So this says, I can't really read it, color alone can make the viewer a bit tired. Some people, okay, enough with the stripes. This is interesting because this is an article that refers to the Jefferson Place Gallery, and it talks about an exhibition among the art. This was their Christmas show. They had a group show every year at Christmas time. And it talks about who's in the show, and then it says, Jasper Johns, a series of new lithographs, works ranging in price from $40 to $250. You could buy a Johns lithograph for about $60 in this show. So here are 3 of the major figures. Upper left, Morris Louis, who dies in 1962. He's the one who dies the youngest from lung cancer. Kenneth Nolan in the center from 2010. Gene Davis, who dies in 1985 in the lower right. And keeping that same sequence, Lewis, Nolan, Davis. On the upper left is Point of Tranquility. This is one of the so-called floral series paintings by Lewis. That's at the Hirshhorn from 1959 to 60. The most important museum for the preservation and conservation of Washington Color School paintings, because they do present particular problems for conservators, because they're somewhere between a painting and a tapestry, because the paint is right into the weave. It is the Hirshhorn. The Hirshhorn conservators are doing the most advanced research about preserving these works. So this is Kenneth Nolan, who does the Chevron series, among others. He does the targets, the chevrons. This is, actually they're not, well, yeah, he did call them targets at one point. Shoot, this is called S-H-O-O-T from 64. This is at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And then, of course, Gene Davis is known for his stripes. This is also at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This is called Flower Machine from 1964. So I'm going to take these artists, and then we're going to look at some of the other protagonists now kind of in sequence. We're going to start with Morris Louis, the most tragic, simply because he dies the youngest from lung cancer. Had Louis lived a full life, no telling what he would have accomplished. This is his wedding portrait in 1947. He marries, his wife's name is Marcella Siegel, and they get married in 1947. He's from Baltimore. He goes to New York for a while. Morris Louis is fascinating because he's, and I say this with tremendous affection, he's so dull. This is the last guy you would think was going to be a painter. There's none of this, let's go to the Cedar Bar and have a fight, and drinking and carousing and adultery, and I'm in my studio, it's my loft, I'm freezing, it's horrible, I'm knocking out these gigantic cans. No, this is not this guy at all. And in fact, to prove that point, this was the house they moved into on Legation Street, Northwest DC, and there's the map right there. That's not actually for the house, by the way. That was a house for sale near this house. This is the house. This front was you can still go by this house. Don't knock on the door, though. This was the dining room, which was 14 feet by 12 feet. This is where he painted. That was his studio. They lived in this house, and that's where he converted the dining room into a studio. So they get married on July 4th, 1947. Again, he's from Baltimore originally. They move to his wife's. Marcella had an apartment in Silver Spring, and it was very small. It was essentially a 2-room apartment. I mean, there was a bathroom and a kitchen, and then 2 rooms. And so in order to paint, he took one of the 2 rooms and turned it into the studio. So they lived and ate and did everything else in the other room. They slept in that room, they ate in that room, but the other room was devoted to his studio. The address was 8010 Eastern Drive in Silver Spring. So that was the studio for a while, and then it was in 1952 that they moved into the district, to this house on Legation Street, 3833 Legation Street Northwest, and then he takes over the dining room, and they remain here for the rest of his life. So he paints these great paintings in a 14 by 12 dining room. And quite frankly, I don't know how he did it, and I'm going to talk about that. And in fact, if somebody tells you they know how he did it, they're lying. And I'll get back to that in a second. So in Lewis's early career, he is, of course, just like all of these artists we've talked about, the abstract expressionists, they got a deal. You got to go through Picasso, Matisse, and Miro. There's no way you can avoid these guys. So you go through them, and then once you go through them, you got to go through the surrealists. Think about automatism, automatic technique. It's like a rite of passage. So these are works. On the left is a work called Submarine, but it's spelled sub-marine, 1948. This is a work we own at the gallery. It's an early Lewis from 1948. This is an untitled work from the same year. It's untitled, but then it's subtitled Fish, because it looks like a fish form. This work is lost today. If you go through the catalog raisonné, which is very exhaustive on Lewis and very meticulous, this painting somehow has escaped location, so we don't know if it's still around, destroyed. But it was a well-known work at the time, one of his early works. So he starts off in a kind of surrealist, sort of Picasso, Matisse, Miro. You can see all the relationships here, the kind of linking of shapes, and this is very Gorky-like. You think of Arshile Gorky, When You're the Milkweed, things like that. So he's working through that, and he then discovers or realizes this isn't, that's not me. I'm just kind of going through this to get it out of my system, and that's not what I really want to do. So he starts to rethink what he'd like to do, and one of the great events for Lewis is the invention of a new paint. Now, very often in art history, we don't talk about this sometimes as much as we should. Sometimes things just move ahead in art history because of science. Like when the Impressionists finally have paint in tubes, and they can go outside and paint instead of having to work in their studio, et cetera. Collapsible easels, the invention of the railroad. I mean, all these things have affected the history of painting and art. And the big invention here, in the 50s, of course, acrylic paint was invented, right? So that was the great advance from oil paint. So we do have in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, with the invention of acrylic paint. Now, a paint that behaves it's very different than oil. It dries quicker, it's very durable, it has incredibly brilliant colors. It can be secured or purchased from your local Utrecht store in gallons and tubes. It just has everything going for it that oil paint, while beautiful, just was a more laborious paint. So acrylic is one kind of paint, but then within the acrylic category, there is a new paint that comes on the scene, and it's called Magna. Here. This is a brand name. This is acrylic, and sometimes if museums are sloppy about their tags, it's technically correct to say this is an acrylic on canvas painting if it's painted in Magna. But in fact, to be more accurate, if it's Magna, you should say it's Magna. Magna on canvas. So once this paint is developed, and here's the guy who did it, and his name was Beaucourt, and here are all the different colors. This is a revolution for a number of painters, Morris Louis among them. Once this paint appears, and it's touted as this, as you see here, the first new painting medium in 500 years, it has so many things. First of all, it is an acrylic resin. It's an acrylic resin. So it has it behaves in a certain way. It has a greater shine or luster to it. It has a glossier finish to it. It is water soluble, so you can dilute it. You can dilute it with turpentine so that it can dribble or run if you're going to stain with it. You can mix it with turpentine and mineral spirits to get even a different consistency. It dries rapidly, which is good, especially if you're painting 900 stripes. You don't want to wait for each one to dry before you can put the next one down. So you get artists, Morris Louis, Barnett Newman, almost all of the color school artists. In pop art, Roy Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein loves this paint, and almost all of Lichtenstein's paintings are in Magna. And what happens is that even these artists have a personal relationship with this gentleman who invents the paint. So they will tell him, can you do this, can you do that? So for example, Lichtenstein they made a special formula for Lichtenstein. He wanted a certain kind of chemical balance of things. And that was also true for Morris Louis. And at first, because Louis was using so much paint and tubes, and by the way, Morris Louis saved every receipt for the purchase of paint or canvas in his life. I mean, every one. So we know exactly how much paint he purchased, how much turpentine he purchased, how many feet of canvas he purchased. He saved every receipt. So you can figure, well, then how did he do this? Well, at that year, he bought this amount of turpentine and this amount of paint, so he might have had this formula, that kind of thing. In any case, Louis had been working earlier on an easel, those earlier paintings, and it was rarely more than 36 by 30 inches, the easel, and he had been using primed canvas, so he would prime the canvas so the paint didn't go in. But then once he moves to oil paint, and then once Magna comes out, he totally switches his ideas, and he starts to paint on unprimed canvas, and he starts to develop, in keeping with the revelation of Helen Frankenballer, now this kind of staining technique. He's working in a 12 by 14 studio in his dining room, and some paintings are longer than 14 feet. So he must have had the painting out the door and did it, and then brought it around and maybe had it out the door this way. Nobody ever saw Morris Louis paint, not even his wife. She was a school teacher and then a principal. She would get up in the morning, they'd have breakfast, she would go to work. He would start painting. Because it dried quickly, when he finished a painting, it would dry pretty quickly. He'd roll it up and put it in the basement. And she'd come home, and he'd usually be sitting on the stoop waiting for her. There wouldn't be a spot of paint on his clothes. He often painted in a tie. There was not a spot of paint on the dining room floor. This is the closest thing to immaculate conception as I've ever heard. And again, if you hear people say, well, he did it this way and then he did it that way, they're just making it up. Maybe they're right, but we have no documentary evidence. We have no visual evidence. We don't have his wife saying, yeah, I used to sit there and watch him paint, like Lee Krasner used to watch Pollock paint or something. None of that. She'd come home, he'd be done, it was dinner time. And down in the basement would be all these rolled up canvases because they had already dried. Now, we know he worked on a kind of stretcher. He made a wooden stretcher, and he would tack the canvas to the top of the stretcher only, and then it would come down and kind of curl to the floor, And there's no human touch in these paintings. He's not using a brush. He's not using his hands. He's spilling the paint, and then he's taking, because the canvas is untacked at the bottom, he can kind of use gravity and let this paint, depending on the series, roll or run in a different way. He might work from the edges to the center, from the top to the bottom. Sometimes we're not even sure how to hang a Morris Louis, and he was fine with that. That's why he didn't sign the paintings on the front. Like in the lower corner, that would tell you that that's the top and this is the bottom. So there's a debate. You may see stripe paintings by Louis that work with the stripes going off the canvas at the bottom, and there's a space at the top, or they could be flipped. And some museums, they're not sure, they flip it, and that's okay. Louis had no problem with that. He didn't really care. So he gave titles to his paintings. Sometimes they're relatively obscure titles. They might be Greek titles like Alpha, Beta, or other things. And you have to kind of forget all the titles because most of the titles came from Clement Greenberg. Greenberg now was a great supporter of Louis. And Louis was very unsure of himself about whether his art was any good. He was very insecure. And Greenberg would come and visit him in Washington and would really sort of pump him up. He put him in that Coots gallery show, which was very important, his first New York show, and Louis was petrified of being in that exhibition. So often when Louis needed a title, he would actually write to Greenberg, and he'd say, I just did this series, and Greenberg would say, okay, let's call it the Unfurls. Let's call it the Veils. Let's call it this, let's call it that. How many of those do you have? Okay, that's a series. And so actually that's how it often happened. So this is a painting on the left that's called Beth, B-E-T-H, Schaff, C-H-A-F, 1959. This is the first series that he executes. It's called the Veil series, V-E-I-L, Veils. He does some Veils in 54. He destroys most of those, and then comes back and does the series from 58 to 59. On the right is the painting I showed you that's at the Hirshhorn. This is Point of Tranquility, 59 to 60. This is the next series called the Floral series because it kind of looks like flowers, but that's really not what he was thinking about. This was from 59 to 60. These are magna on canvas. So he's pouring the paint down and then letting it run. And with the Veils, of course, he's putting layer upon layer of paint. Believe me, to get this correct, to get this right, to make it look like anything that you don't want to throw out is really, really, really tough. I mean, here he's pouring the paint towards the center. So it creates this sort of shape here. So we have the Veils, we have the Florals. This is the Unfurled series that we have here. This is our painting called Beta Kappa from 1961. And then this is the Stripe series. This is our painting. It's currently not on view. It's titled simply a number, 133, from 1962. This Stripe series goes from 61 to 62. This is the last great series. So here, he's starting in the corner, and he has to allow these things to run, and yet he doesn't really want them touching. Sometimes they do, they blur. I'm going to show you a picture I took where I almost put my camera on the canvas, and you can see where they're starting to sort of merge in places like here and here. And then, of course, the great thing about these two series, the great thing is all the white, leaving the center empty and just this white canvas, so that it's a really beautiful sort of interaction between the viewer, the work, the light, the white, and the color. Here, I took this picture, just got really close. So Louis is pivotal. The tragedy of Louis is cancer. He's really coming into his prime. He gets lung cancer. They take out one of his lungs. Then he has cobalt treatments. And by the time he's starting to go through cancer therapy, he stops. He really can't paint. He's too sick. And so he leaves us a little bit too early. This is Kenneth Nolan, two works that we have, Another Time from 1973, and Dawn's Road from 1970. So these are both works that we own at the gallery by Kenneth Nolan. They're not always on view. He's, along with Lewis, they might be the two best-known color school artists from DC. They're a little bit different. Again, they both stain and work on unprimed canvas. They both use magna. But Nolan is more hard edge in terms of how he masks off his canvases to create these more sort of geometric and tightly controlled surfaces. We do have a rich history in Washington that is not given the credit it should be given. And the other thing I would say, and this is totally personal, I'm not speaking for the National Gallery, but I don't think we've ever really supported our local artists very well historically, and including these artists. I just don't think we've ever really made a commitment to our artists. Many of them become very successful and well known, but it's almost despite the fact that they're from Washington. That's a sad statement, which means there are a lot of things here and there. For example, I teach at Catholic University, and Kenneth Nolan taught at Catholic University, and he gave them a painting that was almost totally destroyed when the building that it was housed in caught fire, the Salve Regina Hall, which is where the Department of Art and Art History is. And the painting he had given the university was this painting. It's called Pool, P-O-O-L, from 1959. And it had been caught in this fire. It had suffered burn damage and water damage. And then it had been kind of just forgotten by the university until just recently, what was this, 2014, 15, 16, I don't know, because these are my students. This is Nora Hyman. She's the chair of the Department of Art History. These are two of my students, Ashley Wilson. She wrote a thesis, her junior thesis on Nolan, and she was really responsible for trying to have this painting conserved. So today it has been conserved, and now it hangs in the library at Catholic University. So this is the kind of thing that has happened. A lot of this work wasn't given the kind of care that it should have had as well. All of these artists, almost all, taught at local universities. So, for example, Nolan taught at Catholic University. Morris Lewis taught at what was the Workshop Center for the Arts, which I just mentioned, by Berkowitz. That's where he met Kenneth Nolan. They were teaching in the evenings. Nolan joined Catholic University. Downing and Mehring were the students of Kenneth Nolan at Catholic University. So they studied at Catholic University with Kenneth Nolan. Gene Davis began to teach at the Corcoran in '66. Downing and Mehring, the students of Nolan, went on to teach at the Corcoran from '65 to '68. Paul Reed was appointed assistant professor at the Corcoran in a position he held in '71, and he held that position until '81. So he was at the Corcoran for 10 years. Kenneth Young taught at the Corcoran School of Art from '73 to '85. He later went on to do exhibition design at the Duke Ellington School of the Arts. Sam Gilliam and Ann Truitt both taught at the University of Maryland in College Park. I actually studied with both of them. I took a sculpture class from Ann Truitt, and I took a painting class from Sam Gilliam, even though I was an art history major, because they were there at the time that I was doing my PhD in art history. Alma Thomas taught for 35 years in a segregated junior high school in DC. So they had a huge impact, not just on the art scene, but on students and on artists who would go on, or students who would go on to become important artists. This was 2014. This was the postcard that we sent out, not this part, because this is now held as some of the ephemera at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Here's Gene Davis, Black Popcorn, 65, Blue Broad Jump, 60. These are both in our collection today. This one's up, this one's not. Everybody had a different tack. We think of Downing, he was doing the dots. Mehring was doing the sort of big, sort of horizontal vertical lines. Lewis was staining. Paul used to say he liked to blot. He was kind of a blotter. And of course, Davis is associated with stripes, which means we have the invention of a new paint, Magna, which is great for all of these things because it dries quickly, it's durable, etc. But if you're going to do a lot of stripes, it would be good to be able to mask things off. And until masking tape is invented, that was a problem. So masking tape is invented in 1925. And it was invented by the 3M employee. Actually, his name was Richard Drew. And he did it first for auto body workers. He noticed that when they would repair cars and paint them, and they would use butcher paper that they had taped, when they would pull off the butcher paper and the tape, it would scar the surface, and that would drive them crazy. So he invented a tape for 3M that you could pull off and it wouldn't leave any residue or any scar on the actual metal. And then, of course, artists picked this up. And here's a woman striping off with masking tape to create a kind of Gene Davis-like painting. This is Thomas Downing on the left. Billy's Ring, Preliminary, 1965. Downing was very influenced by Eastern philosophy, Zen, looking at a spot until you kind of have to look at your belly button or something. Gemini, this is by Howard Mehring. These are paintings we own. This one is up at the moment. This one is not. This is Alma Thomas. This is on the right, Red Rose Cantata from 1973. She's fascinating and very, very important. In 1972, she was 80 years old, and she was the first African-American woman to receive a solo exhibition at the Whitney in New York. She grew up in Georgia, in Columbus, Georgia, before she settled in D.C. She's the first graduate of Howard University's art department. They had just created an art department, and she was the first graduate in 1924. In the 50s, she took weekend and night classes at American University. By the way, a lot of these people also taught at American University, and American University has an important role to play in preserving, protecting, and exhibiting these works as well. She had been a representational painter initially, and then she turned to abstraction. She was a school teacher. She taught in a segregated school. But then in 1960, she just decided, I'm done teaching. I'm going to commit myself totally to my painting. When the Obamas were in the White House, they hung one of her paintings in their dining room. She talked about, of course, color. She creates this beautiful kind of, how would you describe it, kind of a beautiful, almost not quite a waffle-like pattern. She said, quote, "Through color, I have sought to concentrate on beauty and happiness rather than on man's inhumanity to man." She talked about what it meant to be a painter, an African-American painter, an African-American woman. And she says, quote, "One of the things we couldn't do was go into museums, let alone think of hanging our pictures there. She goes, my times have changed. Just look at me now." These are works that we have now. I think this one is up now. Pansies in Washington from 1969. And on the right is Autumn Drama from 1969. So these are our pictures, but only one is up, the one on the left. Kenneth Young, another African-American artist who's kind of fell through the cracks. He just died 2017, March 23rd, at the age of 83. But he lived long enough to see this, which is one of his works installed at the National Gallery. So he had significant shows before that. He had exhibitions at the Fisk University, at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, but those shows had happened over 30 years ago. So he had, again, sort of been forgotten. He's interesting because he's born in Louisville in 33, which is the same year that Sam Gilliam is born. Gilliam is born in Mississippi. Young is born in Louisville, but as almost by the time Gilliam's parents, Gilliam was 1 or 2 years old, they moved to Louisville. So they both grew up together in Louisville, but they didn't meet each other until they went to college. And they met at the University of Louisville, Sam Gilliam and Kenneth Young. Young got his master's degree, that's where Gilliam got his master's degree. Young moved to DC in '64 to take a job not as a painter or to be a painter, but to be an exhibits designer at the Smithsonian. In the '70s, and again, this is a long story that we don't have time to go through, there was really nowhere for a black artist, especially if you were painted abstractly. You didn't have a lot of options. It was a kind of a segregated art scene in DC. Young talked about this. He said, quote, "I kind of stumbled into this way of painting by finding a tool that would give me this result. The painting technique was painting wet in wet. With magna and acrylic, you very often painted wet in wet. You don't have to wait for the previous layer to dry. You could put wet on top of wet. Painting wet in wet produced halos around these objects, this kind of halo effect, which looked like outer space or inner space." Again, there's a kind of surrealist idea. His paintings do have a kind of cosmic sort of feeling, like you're looking into the Milky Way or something in that regard. He was fortunate again, long time in coming, but with the building of the MGM National Harbor Casino and all that, which I've never been to, they have an art gallery, or they have art, and they purchased one of his works too. They purchased this work. It's called Spring Rain from 1970. So that hangs now at the MGM National Harbor. In 2019, which is 2 years after he died, American University gave him a comprehensive retrospective. They're planning, sorry. This is on the books now for American University. Thank you for correcting me. In 2019, there'll be a huge retrospective devoted to him at American University. Again, kind of late, but better late than never, I guess. And then he's also due for an exhibition in 2019 at the University of Maryland. Here he is at work, unstretched, again, unprimed, working on the floor. Maybe the artist now, he's a younger generation that everybody knows as Sam Gilliam. We think of works like this, relative, that we have here at the gallery, where he's working on canvas that he then allows to kind of drape with all these colors. And he's done a huge series of works like this. 1969 is this one. But he starts off like this. So Gilliam, nobody looks at this stuff anymore. Today we think of him as using this canvas in this loose and free way. But he starts off as a pure color school painter. This is a painting called Blue Let, L-E-T, Blue Let, from 1965. African-American artists were neglected, and so have some of the women been neglected. This is Hilda Thorpe, who died in 2000. So Hilda Thorpe is from Maryland. She died in Alexandria, Virginia. She was born in 1919 and died in 2000. She's another artist associated with American University. She began taking classes there in the 30s. She graduated in '59. And she was given an exhibition at the gallery that was at American University at that time, was called the Watkins Gallery. And she had a show actually with Alma Thomas. It was a two-person show, so it was the two ladies together. She then became the director of the gallery after that. And she appeared at the Jefferson Place Gallery very often, starting in '59. She would show at the Jefferson Place Gallery pretty regularly until it closed in 1974. She taught also, like everybody. She taught at the Mount Vernon Seminary and Junior College. Then she taught at American University. And then she went on to teach at the Corcoran. So again, all those places. She is very diverse. What I like about her is that she doesn't stay in one place. So we think of her as color school, and certainly there's a body of work that relates to that. But then she worked into collage, she did sculpture, she worked in sheet metal. I mean, she is really quite avaricious. I mean, she always wants to change, she's thinking, she's changing. So she has a wonderful body of work that is very, very broad in its sort of statements. She never really is what you would call a color school painter in the sense of staining or doing these sort of, she's actually more gestural. She's almost more in keeping with the New York school. This is Red Shelf on the left from 1960, and Return on the right from 1961. These are in private collections today. Her collages are beautiful. This is from 1960. It's untitled here. This is fairly large. This is also in a private collection. If you go to the Phillips collection, although they don't rarely put these out, here she is late in the 70s. So this is Horizon Blue, Divide from 1975, and this is Horizon Yellow, Veiled from 1975. These are oil pastel on paper. She's magnificent with the oil pastel. So Hilda Thorpe should be better known, and so should Helen Mckenzie here. She's an important part of color school. She shows at the Jefferson Place Gallery. She was born in Chicago. This is an announcement card for her show. That was the first anniversary of the gallery in 58. It had opened in 57, and then this exhibition was in 58. She received a bachelor's degree in English at the University of Chicago. Then she studied painting at the Art Institute. She came to Washington in 1949, and she worked with faculty at American University. And who was at American University at that time was an artist you've probably heard of, Jack Twerkoff, and she worked with him. She was included in the Corcoran's annual exhibitions. She also was a manager, after Hilda Thorpe, of the Watkins Gallery for a while. And she ended up teaching for 25 years at American University, a very long career. She exhibited at New York. The gallery most of these artists showed at in New York was called the Stable Gallery in New York City. She had a show at the Jefferson Gallery in '63, and the Washington Post critic noted about that show. He said, quote, "The categorical honesty of her statement is characteristic of the artist as a painter and as a person. The vital painterly approach she has used has been a signature from the beginning, unchanged and uninfluenced by the new little isms that sweep the art world each season. The strong slashing brushstrokes are laid on with a strength and vigor that admits of no compromise. There are no blurred or uncertain corners in this painting." I would say, and again, this is a personal opinion, that one of the reasons, and maybe I shouldn't say this now that I think about it. Oh, what the hell? We can cut it out of the tape. I think one of the reasons that Washington has never achieved the recognition, the status, is also because of the poor quality of the art writing in the city. Yeah, the criticism in writing about art, contemporary and modern art. And again, this is not a blanket. There are writers who are good, and I'm not saying everybody today who writes for the Post should go home or something. But it certainly isn't, and hasn't been the equivalent of other cities like New York, et cetera. So there are a number of things about that have affected this. First of all, this is a museum town. It's not a commercial gallery town. Secondly, people who are into contemporary art, it's close enough to go to New York and buy contemporary art. It's conservative. You're not going to, a lot of people, this is a conservative town. All of these things. I worked in commercial galleries in the 80s on what was then 7th Street. And they were trying to make 7th Street the great gallery corridor that would connect the Smithsonian with the mall. And they built 406 7th Street, Ramon Osuna, Diane Brown, McIntosh Drysdale, all these galleries that were in there, Harry Lunn, all these people. And that was a huge failure. People started working back to P Street, to DuPont Circle, et cetera. So that's the way it is. What can I tell you? This is Helen Mckenzie, Untitled on the left, 1955. By the way, I don't mean Joe Phelan. Joe Phelan writes wonderfully, by the way. You should read Joe Phelan. So he's an exception. There might be somebody else here. I'm sure you're an exception too. Untitled on the left, 1955, in a private collection. A lot of these works are in private collections. They're not in museums. This is Mckenzie called Spring Landscape on the right from 55. Now, one of the women of the movement, of the group, certainly rose above any of the problems, and she just had an exhibition here, and that's Ann Truitt. So Ann Truitt, now I have, I've been keeping sculpture kind of separate from painting, but in this case I'm making an exception. We just had a huge exhibition of Ann Truitt's work in the Tower Gallery. And so Ann Truitt's well-established, well-known, well-respected. Her work is everywhere. This is her in her studio in 1962, the Twinning Court studio. And this is a different studio she had on 35th Street from 1979. She worked in this studio here. It was in a carriage house in an alley near DuPont Circle, very famous. I'll show you the building in a second. The stories are legendary. It was unheated, it was infested with rats, but it was very spacious. She had a lot of space, unlike Morris Louis in the dining room. And so she, working in that gallery, in that studio space, she could start to work on a large scale. She's born in Baltimore. So many of these artists come from Baltimore. Grace Hartigan came from Baltimore, remember? A rich tradition in Baltimore. She studied psychology at Bryn Mawr. She graduated in 43. She worked as an assistant in a psychiatric lab at the Massachusetts General Hospital, but then by the 40s she left. She was interested in psychology, but then she moved away from that, and she wrote fiction. She's a wonderful writer. She's written 3 books, Day Book, Turn, I can't remember the other, anybody know? You should read all 3 of them. They're beautiful. I mean, I'm prejudiced because I studied with her. I liked her very much. She was very nice to me when I was at Maryland. In any case, she's a great writer, a poet, had a great critical sense. She relocates to Washington in 48. And actually, the 2 artists that she's most influenced by are not color school people. They're New York artists, Ad Reinhardt and Barnett Newman. When she sees their paintings, and especially this kind of field, monochromatic, she really was impressed. She saw those for the first time in the Guggenheim in 1961, and so she begins to take up sculpture in wood, painted in a monochromatic way. I look at these sculptures, and they are almost as much painting as sculpture. That's why I feel it's okay to kind of bring her in here. Of course, she was a professor of art history at Maryland for a number of years, throughout the 80s and 90s, I think up until her death, almost. And she died in 2004. I always like this picture because at this point in time, when you look at all those ads about women as the queen of the kitchen, and they're standing next to a big freezer or refrigerator, and they're kind of pointing to it, she's definitely different. Because they're all very nicely dressed usually, and they're holding, look at my freezer. And here she is in front of one of her works of art. This was our show. I hope some of you saw it. It just closed in July 8th. Ironically, interestingly, this was the first major presentation of her work here. So that was, at the National Gallery. Yep. This is a wonderful work called Insurrection. You have to photograph it in 3 different ways because it requires you to look around. 1962. This is one of her larger works. It's 8.5 feet tall, and this is our collection, so you can see it. I don't know if we have it back out. She's wonderful. She certainly is influenced and thinks about minimalism. Donald Judd is important. She thinks about, it's like bringing Donald Judd together with Barnett Newman in some ways. She's great at the way she fabricates these materials, the precision. They're painted over and over again. There's the multiple, even if it's just one color. I mean, it goes over it so that it's almost like you're brought right into the work through the surface that she's able to create. She's very studio-oriented. She was somewhat reclusive. I mean, she taught, which is interesting because you have to have some kind of outgoing personality. But she really was at home in her studio. She said, quote, "In my studio, I feel at home with myself, peaceful at heart, remote from the world, totally immersed in a process so absorbing as to be its own reward. You should read her books, Turn, Daybook. They're really quite good. This is work Knight's Heritage on the left from 63. Summer Remembered from 1981. Now, one of the things you notice immediately that would not put her in the camp of the minimalists are these evocative poetic titles. You know, Donald Judd never did a work called Summertime. That's just not the way these guys work. It's just like, there it is, it's a block. So she has an evocative poetic sensibility. You think of summertime and we think of sun, we think of yellow, but it's not overly stated. Knight's Heritage, it's almost like a banner on some kind of heraldic kind of a shield or a banner during a medieval tournament or something. She's great. I mean, she's just really, and she pares it right down to the essence of things. This is where she worked. This is off of DuPont Circle. It's 2123 Twinning Court Northwest. It was a carriage house. And from what I can figure out, and some of you may know more of this than I do, it was sold not too long ago. This is the building today. And it had gone through a number of different changes. It had been 2 different nightclubs. One was called the Frat House, and then it was called Omega. And then it was sold to a private family, to a private person who plans to turn it into his own house. It was built in 1905 as a carriage house. So he had to get, the reason I know some of this, it had to go in front of the zoning board for him to be able to convert this into a private residence, which is apparently being done, even though this is on the National Register of Historic Places. So you figure it out. So I haven't been by it recently. Maybe there's a house there now that's in its place now. This was one of the great color school shows at the Smithsonian American Art Museum that took place a number of years ago. And here's Ann Truitt, here's Paul Reed, and that work is by, is that Kenneth Nolan? No. Yeah, that is Kenneth Nolan. That's called Split here. So a group of the artists here. This was I don't know how many of you saw it. It was a beautiful exhibition. These artists work well together. They're like the abstract expressionists in the sense that when you get them all together in a room, it really is quite stunning. This was a show at the Corcoran. This is a painting by Paul Reed that now we have at the National Gallery, but it's currently not out. And this is a Howard Mehring painting here. This was a show called Washington Color and Light that took place in 2011. This especially featured the work of Paul Reed in it, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about him in a second. So actually, let's go. This is Paul Reed, who just passed away, 2015. And this is Paul Reed in the 70s in his studio here. Another photo in his studio. This is a self-portrait, pencil on paper from 1938. Reed has a fascinating, again, like all these people, fascinating history. He had a number of jobs. He worked in an engraving shop. He was an illustrator. He went into the Peace Corps. I mean, he had a lot of different types of training that all came to hold him in great stead once he turned towards devoting himself to painting. This is from the Phillips collection. It's titled Number 22A. Like most of these artists, he just gives things, for the most part, numbers, but they tend, like Morris Louis, to be series. So this is the Mandala series. Mandala is a Sanskrit word for circle. So a lot of these paintings are circular. He is working on unprimed canvas. He's staining. Number 16J at the left from 63. Number 26A on the right. He's very, like a lot of these artists, he was very much influenced by Jungian psychology. In fact, Paul was interested in everything. But he was interested in psychology, he was interested in astronomy, he was doing a series at the end of his life that was sort of based on ideas he had talked with about two people at NASA about. So a lot of these shapes and forms have a kind of Jungian idea of archetypes and things of that nature. He varies, he starts to introduce different motifs, the triangle, the circle, this has the dot here. It's all about color relationship, how things resonate and speak. This is number 17. Today, this is at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. Now, why is it in Oklahoma? Well, once the Washington Gallery of Modern Art closed, and it had amassed this large collection of Washington Color School painting, it was a question of what are we going to do with all these paintings? And again, I wasn't around, but it would have been nice if they stayed in the district, if they maybe had been sold or given off to various local DC collections where we could still see them today. But instead, there was a relationship that one of the board members had at the Washington Gallery with a board member in Oklahoma. And they acted in Oklahoma very quickly. And they bought the whole collection for $110,000. So one of the finest collections now of Washington Color School painting is at this museum in Oklahoma. They're taking very good care of it, and they're very proud. And if you go to their website, it's a whole section of their website devoted to this. So it's not that they don't have a good home. They have a very good home. So maybe that was for the best. This painting by Paul Reed, number 17 from '64, they just did a show in Oklahoma that was from the Pompidou Center. It was on Matisse and his time. And when the Pompidou Center sent the show and they were discussing, curators were talking, they said, we really want to, part of that catalog and exhibition was the effect that Matisse has had on other artists. There was a discussion and they included this painting in the show to relate to Matisse. That exhibition, if I'm not mistaken, was 2016. This is my own comparison. So this is Paul Reed on the right, number 8A from 1964, against Matisse's large composition with mass, one of the paper collages, a detail. He changes, he works through different sequences. This is the so-called disc series. These are on the left from the Hirshhorn, on the right from the Phillips collection. Number 4A on the left from 65, number 12 on the right from 65. When these works were first shown, critics, again in New York and elsewhere, wrote very favorably about them. One critic said, quote, "The smoothly brushed backgrounds in the wedge-shaped areas he usually includes in the upper right and lower left corners are unmixable colors created by superimposing one layer of transparent acrylic on a lower layer that has already dried." There's a lot of this layering that you don't sense at first until you look carefully, and that's about the Morris Louis veils. There it's more evident. You can sense, my gosh, he's put 15, layers of paint over each other. The discs were part of that landmark traveling exhibition that Nordland had opened at the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. This is the disc that's at Smithsonian American Art Museum from 1965, number 1D as in dog. Paul Reed works like Matisse and like others, very clear series. So like Lewis, the florals, the unfurls, the veils, the stripes. This series at the top is a series called the Upstart Series that began in '66. And then it has different subtitles. So this work on the upper left by Reed is called Coherence, number 16, Roman numeral 16, 1966. And I'm comparing it to Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles from 1952 because Paul Reed himself made this analogy that once he moved away from the circular forms, those floral circular forms, the discs, he started to think more about rectilinear forms into a grid. And the Upstart series begins around in 1966. These were featured at a very important exhibition of his work, a one-man show he had in New York in '67. So there are a lot of works within the Upstart series. They have different names: coherence, intersection, interchange, and they are a departure now to more hard edge kind of bands. Sometimes they zigzag instead of going the way that you see them here. But he mentioned specifically that he had been thinking about this idea coming from Pollock with this horizontal, vertical kind of idea. He's instrumental in beginning to shape canvases. This is Barcelona from Barcelona number 4 from 1965. Once he got to the Upstart series, it seemed logical that he'd start to actually alter the shape of the canvas itself and create these rectilinear patterns. He talked about these works as geometric abstractions. That's what he referred to them as. A lot of works in this series, again, there's a series called Topeka, Hackensack, Ziegfeld, and the Barcelona series. This is the Barcelona series here. These are some of his notes. Here, and this is a page of notes for the Topeka series, which are also shaped canvases. So this is a study from '67 where he's working out some of the geometry here. And then 2 examples of the Topeka number 6 and number 11, both from 1967. The notes, when you go through his teaching notes or just notes in general, not just teaching notes, but his notes for his paintings and his journals, I mean, they're really quite sophisticated, geometric, and very, very sophisticated. He's often working from certain theories of geometry, the golden section, things like that. He's very, very precise and well-versed in geometry. This was his house. I got to know Paul in 2009. I was asked to write about his art for an exhibition, and in 2009, I started to spend a lot of time with Paul and right up to his death, and I'm still involved in a lot of ways with his sort of legacy. So this is his home. He had a home, like Morris Louis, late in life, he didn't have a studio. He worked in his house, and this was in Arlington, Virginia, and this is from 2011. These are all paintings stacked everywhere. Things on some of these today are in various collections. I went through the entire house. He had things under the bed, in the attic, in the basement. One room was just wall-to-wall paintings. You couldn't get in the room because it was just stacked with paintings against each other, like a big Rolodex kind of thing. Here's his house again. This is the Gilport series, the Barcelona series here. Downstairs, he used to call this Monet's tomb. He had every work catalog that he had ever done. He had notebooks about everything. Here, there were his teaching notes from the Corcoran. He had taught at the Corcoran for 10 years. It was just chock-a-block with material. You went up to one of the bedrooms. This is that, I just showed you that. And this is this. This is at Georgetown now. These are both at Georgetown University Library. He gave a number of works to Georgetown and to the University of Maryland University College, and also the University of Maryland College Park. Then there are the works in Oklahoma. And then, ironically, we did not have a work by Paul Reed at the National Gallery. So that was finally rectified. In case you forgot what the concourse looked like before the change, this was the old concourse. So this is now where Rachel White-Reed is going in. And remember I told you we have flipped. The permanent collection now goes up, and the concourse is for special exhibitions. But in the past, the concourse was for the permanent collection. So here you see works close in Byron Kim and Naumann. And here's a work that was given to the gallery in 2012, and it's from the Upstart series by Paul Reed. It's called Coherence. This is currently off view, so these are photographs when it was unveiled in 2012. I'm comparing this to Donald Judd because Judd actually wrote a review of Reed's second exhibition at the East Hampton Gallery in the Hamptons in the New York Herald Tribune in 1964. So he talked about the certain similarities here. Paul was in his 90s when this work came into the collection, and here he is. So we had a little unveiling for him, and this is January 19th, 2012, when we unveiled the work. There's the label. It was a gift to the gallery. Here we are. That's Harry Cooper. That's me. This was January 19th, 2012. After the unveiling, I invited Paul to come and give a gallery talk about the painting, and here it is here. This was June 5th and 7th. He gave it twice, June 5 and 7 at 2012. Once we inherited the Corcoran work, once we acquired this work, we had one Paul Reed, which was a great one, and it had to be great. Otherwise, Harry wouldn't take it. It had to have certain stipulations, because we don't deaccession works, so we can only take the highest quality. So it had to be big. It had to be of the prime period of Paul. It had to be in perfect shape, all of these criteria, and this one met all of those criteria. And the gentleman who gifted it to us was willing to gift it to us. But then after the Corcoran collection came to us, we now have these 4 works. So this is one here. I showed you that one. That's now part of our collection called In and Out, letter B, from 66 to 69. So these are both paintings. And these are prints, silkscreen on woven paper, Barcelona, and down here, Ziegfeld from 1970. Here's Paul when we were visiting together in 2009. Talk about cramped. Some of the last works he did were on muslin, and he hung them in the windows of his house, and they're transparent. So when I first arrived in 2009, all of the windows were covered with these muslin paintings, and it was kind of his version of the Rothko or the Matisse chapel, because the whole house was illuminated by color. Here he is working outside. So this is the basement, like where the washing machine is somewhere around here. I think it's over here. And then the basement walked out onto a patio. These are some of his sculptures. And it went down to a creek towards the Potomac River down here. He spent a lot of time outside in the end, and he did a lot of interesting things. He did this whole series on found objects. He'd just go out for walks, and he would look for stuff, and he would find some. The one that I love the most is he found this rock that looks just like Boccioni's sculpture of his mother, anti-graceful. He put it on a pedestal. You'd swear it was a sculpture by Boccioni, things like that. By this time, he was losing his eyesight. He was almost totally blind. And so he worked with a loupe and magnifying glass. He had to work really close. It didn't stop him. He knew his way around. 4 o'clock, we stopped for cocktails. Here he is a little bit later. This is 2009 on the left at the age of 90, and 2011 on the right at the age of 92. And then to bring this right up to the present, about 3 weeks ago, July 15th, 2018, the work that had been given to the University of Maryland University College, they have currently up, you can see it, it's up until September 16th. University of Maryland University College, not the art gallery at College Park, but it's that big hotel, the Marriott. It's a conference center. They have an art gallery. And that's where his work is currently hanging, and it is some of the 200 works that were given to the University of Maryland University College. And these are the found works that he then put on pedestals. This is sculpture. This is his living room here before he started putting up all the muslin. So if you go to University of Maryland University College in Adelphi, just adjacent to the campus, there's the show of some of the 200 works that have been given to the UMUC. And we had a little, well, I didn't actually organize this, but I was present. July 15th, there was a little kind of unveiling. This is his daughter. This is Jean Reed Roberts, who lives in Phoenix. And she came out because she's been overseeing the sort of gifts and where the works are going now in various places. So she came out to talk about her father's work. These are the directors and curators at the UMUC. That's Eric Key on the left. He's the director of the UMUC Arts Program. And that's the curator, John West Bay, on the right. So this was just recently, in July 15th. And the show is up until September, so try to go down and see it. Now I'm going to end by going back to theory and talk about Rosenberg versus Greenberg, because this will be important as we go down the road. We have two critics who approached abstract expressionism in two different ways. And in the case of Rosenberg, what he thought abstract expression was about was the very act of painting. Here, he said, at a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than as a space in which to reproduce. So for him, he coins the phrase action painters, action painting. And actually, he had an interview with Pollock. Pollock never said action painting. He said that it was action. He used the word action, but he never coined the phrase exactly that way. But in any case, in the history now, action painting, action painters is coined, that term is coined by Rosenberg. That will take us in a different direction than Greenberg. Greenberg's famous quote here is, and it's of course dense, because he was dense. But the important point is that he said the task of self-criticism in modern art became to eliminate from the specific effects of each art any and every effect that might conceivably be borrowed from or by the medium of any other art. Thus, would each art be rendered pure, and in its purity, find the guarantee of its standard of quality. So what he's saying is, what's important in each art is what is inherent to that art that cannot be replicated or duplicated in another art. So in the act or the art of painting, what is inherent and self-defining about painting are two things: color and flatness. So anything that's going to follow abstract expressionism has to be about color and flatness, and Washington was perfect, right? Harold Rosenberg says, that's a bunch of hokey. What's important was the act, the process, being in the moment. And that's going to track in a different way. So if you follow the Greenberg Avenue, you go to Washington. If you follow the Rosenberg Avenue, you will go to pop art, performance, happenings, all of these things that are very different. So here you have it. Rosenberg will champion Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg and pop and performance and happenings, Klaus Oldenburg's, all that stuff, right? Greenberg will call this kitsch, that this isn't really art because it's not about purity. He'll favor this. That's Kenneth Nolan, remember? That's called Mandarin. This is in our collection through the Meyerhoffs from 1961. Rosenberg, Greenberg. Right? Two different ways. Canyon by Robert Rauschenberg, 59. Blue Veil by Morris Louis from 1958. So what are the camps? What's the old and new guard for Clement Greenberg? This is it. This is the old guard, the abstract expressionist, New York School, right? We talked about 1951. This is the new guard, all the Washington artists. Sam Gilliam, Mehring, Reed, Thomas, Davis, Nolan, Lewis, and Downing, right? So that's his legacy photo, shall we say. What's the legacy photo for Rosenberg? It's this. You go from these guys to these guys, who are now all represented by Leo Castelli. And who do we have with Leo Castelli in this photograph from 1982? Ellsworth Kelly, Dan Flavin, Joseph Kossuth, Richard Serra, Lawrence Weiner, a bunch, but most importantly, Jasper Johns In the back, you have Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol. This is his stable. This is his stable of artists, very different than the Washington Color School artists. So that, you have to understand that that's now the break or the fork in the road that will then take you down two different evolutionary tracks as you go later into the 20th century. Thanks, everybody.